Welcome to Forgotten Shadows, where history leaves behind more than dust and ink, where records speak in whispers and children's laughter hides a darker resonance. Tonight we journey back to Salem, Massachusetts, 1867, a farming town of quiet barns, endless cornfields, and families bound together by faith and labor. But beneath its simple charm lay a story so disturbing that it was nearly erased from memory. The case of Timothy Caldwell. A boy of only 8 years, whose pale blue eyes watched the world with the curiosity of a scientist and the cold detachment of a predator. Within months, 3 deaths would rip through his community, leaving neighbors to question not only the boy, but the very boundaries of innocence itself. What makes a child capable of calculated murder? And what happens when the brightest smile hides the darkest hunger? As you listen, imagine yourself walking those dirty roads of Missouri in 1867. And when you reach the end of this chapter, tell us in the comments, where and when do you believe? History hides its most chilling secrets. The town of Salem was young in 1867, its streets dust with the tracks of wagons and horses, its fields alive with the hard rhythm of harvest. Families lived in close clusters of farms, bound by the certainty of long winters and the faith that God's order held all things steady. But whispers had already begun by summer's end, carried in low voices from porch to porch, whispers about the Caldwell boy. Timothy Caldwell was 8 years old that summer, thin as the cornstalks he wandered between, with hair the color of dried straw and eyes so pale they seemed to almost catch the morning light. To neighbors, he appeared shy and soft-spoken, a child who often lingered at the edge of groups rather than joining them. Yet behind the quiet, there were moments that unsettled those who looked too closely. Other children said he would watch insects with an intensity that made them uneasy, pulling apart wings, counting legs, whispering observations as if taking notes in some secret ledger of the mind. Once, a farmer's daughter claimed she woke to find Timothy standing by her window at night, staring not at her face, but at her hands, the way her fingers moved when she clutched the curtain. In the farming community, strange behaviors were explained away as quirks. Some children are slow, the elders muttered. Some are simply different. But Salem was about to learn that Timothy Caldwell was neither slow nor merely different. The first death occurred on an unremarkable September evening. A calf was found strangled behind the barn of the Whitaker farm, its body stiff, its eyes bulging with a grotesque finality. The Whitakers assumed it was the work of a wolf or a desperate thief. But there were no tracks in the mud, no signs of struggle, only the unsettling impression of small footprints nearby. Too small to be, a man's too deliberate to be dismissed. Days later, the youngest Whitaker daughter, a child no older than Timothy himself, fell ill. Her fever rose with frightening speed, accompanied by stomach cramps and shallow breaths. Within 3 days, she was gone, her body buried before the frost set in. The doctor, Samuel Harding, who had recently moved to Salem, examined the case, but could not find a cause beyond an affliction of the blood. Yet he noted the odd discoloration around her lips and tongue, marks that didn't align with fever alone. It was Harding who first noticed Timothy lingering by the graveside, longer than the other children. While most wept and clung to their mothers, Timothy stood still, watching the coffin lowered into the earth with an expression that could not be named. His lips curved in what might have been mistaken for sadness, yet his eyes betrayed no tears, no tremor, no grief. Autumn crept across Salem, Massachusetts, turning the fields brittle with cold. The community buried its sorrow in work, but unease grew. A second child, from another farm, was found lifeless in bed, her body strangely rigid, her eyes frozen wide as if staring at something unseen. The doctor's notes later recorded a detail that unsettled him. No evidence of disease, body intact. Death appears sudden, as if induced rather than suffered. When Harding walked to the farmstead to gather information, he found Timothy in the barn, poking at the carcass of a crow with a stick, studying the way the wings bent against the wood. The boy looked up at him, smiled faintly, and returned to his work as though the doctor had not been there. Harding began to suspect. Not openly. Such an accusation would have shattered the fragile trust of Salem. But privately, he recorded his concerns. He noted how Timothy seemed to appear near every tragedy, how animals shrank from his touch, how children avoided his games. Most disturbing of all, Harding wrote, was the boy's gaze. A child's face with a man's hunger. He observes not with playfulness, but with calculation. His curiosity is not the curiosity of learning, but of control. By the close of November, a third death would strike. A farmhand, older and strong, was found dead in the hayloft. His body bore strange bruises along the neck, marks too deliberate to be dismissed as accident. His death, unlike the others, could not be hidden. The town gathered in confusion, whispering about curses, about sickness, about punishment from God. And once more, Timothy Caldwell stood among them, watching. His pale blue eyes did not wander to the grieving, nor to the prayers. They lingered instead on the doctor, Samuel Harding, as though the boy already knew the physician had begun to see the truth. The shadows of Salem deepened, not from the coming winter, but from the darkness that walked in the shape of a child. The winter of 1867 clung to Salem like a damp shroud. Snowfall layered itself upon the rooftops and fields, but beneath the surface of that quiet farming community, something darker was beginning to stir. The first death came quietly, almost too quietly, and might have passed as a tragic accident, if not for the unsettling details that lingered in its wake. Timothy Caldwell was just 8 years old then, a boy with pale skin and hauntingly clear blue eyes that reflected more calculation than innocence. Neighbors often described him as polite, soft-spoken, even delicate in his mannerisms. Yet there was a growing unease among those who spent time in his company, as though some unspoken truth hid behind his frozen stare. The victim was a young farmhand named Jacob Miller, scarcely older than 17. He had worked on the Caldwell property for 2 short weeks, tending to the livestock and splitting firewood for the family's stove. One evening, Jacob failed to return home. His body was discovered near the edge of the Caldwell barn, sprawled awkwardly in the snow, as though he had collapsed mid-step. The coroner attributed the cause to a sudden seizure, noting small traces of foam at the boy's lips. It was explained away as natural misfortune, a hidden sickness that had gone unnoticed. In most towns, that might have ended the matter, but Salem was small enough that whispers carried quickly, and the whispers began to focus on Timothy. Several neighbors recalled seeing him nearby at the hour Jacob collapsed. They said the boy lingered at the barn doors, his hands clasped neatly behind his back, watching Jacob intently. What unsettled them more was his expression. No fear, no confusion, no grief. Just quiet, fixed observation, as though he had been studying an expected outcome. When questioned, Timothy gave precise details of Jacob's final moments, describing the way the farmhand twitched and convulsed, the faint gurgling sound in his throat, and how his body eventually stilled. He spoke of it without hesitation, almost with fascination, as though recounting the stages of a school experiment. His words chilled Dr. Samuel Harding, the local physician who had been called to inspect the body. Dr. Harding took note of the boy's uncanny composure. Children were often frightened by sudden death, prone to weeping or clinging to their mothers. Timothy, however, seemed detached, as though Jacob's passing was nothing more than a predictable conclusion. Still, there was no proof of wrongdoing, and Harding, bound by science and reason, could only file the incident away in his private notes. But as the days passed, the physician found himself returning to Timothy in thought. He replayed the boy's mannerisms, the way his eyes never seemed to blink for long, the calculated pauses between his words. And he could not dismiss a growing suspicion that Timothy Caldwell had not merely witnessed Jacob's death. He had orchestrated it. It would not be long before this suspicion was given terrifying weight, for the first death in Salem was only the beginning. The register of tragedy had been opened, and Timothy's name would soon be written deeper within its pages. And so, Salem, Massachusetts, entered a season of shadows, where innocence could no longer be trusted, and every neighbor's glance carried unspoken dread. The first death was accepted as an accident, but the town would not be so quick to excuse the second. By the spring of 1867, the air in Salem had grown heavier, though no one spoke openly of why. Jacob Miller's death lingered, in memory like a bruise beneath the skin, a discomfort never fully addressed. The community resumed its routines, but beneath the rhythm of plowing fields and mending fences, there existed a quiet awareness. Something unnatural had settled over the Caldwell farm. It was in April, as the thaw loosened the soil and the Salem winds carried the scent of rain, that a second tragedy struck. And this one would not pass so easily as a misfortune of nature. The victim was Mrs. Eleanor Wright, a widow in her early 40s who lived just a mile from the Caldwell property. Eleanor was known for her generosity, often bringing baked bread to the neighboring families, and she was one of the few who occasionally kept Timothy's company. She pitied the boy, she once confessed, believing him lonely in the wide silence of the farm. "He has the eyes of a lost child," she told her sister, "always searching for something he cannot name." But Eleanor would not live to see the summer. On a damp Thursday morning, her body was discovered by her sister, sprawled across her parlor floor. Her face bore a peculiar distortion, as though frozen mid-expression, caught between shock and terror. There were no visible wounds, no evidence of forced entry. The cause was declared sudden heart failure. But for those who had known Eleanor, the explanation rang hollow. She had been a strong woman, hearty in her habits, with no history of illness. The idea that she had simply collapsed was unconvincing at best. It was Dr. Samuel Harding once again, who examined the body. And as he did, he noticed something deeply unsettling. Beneath Eleanor's fingernails were faint traces of blood, her own, the result of scratching at her skin. And upon closer inspection, her eyes, once warm and clear, showed burst vessels, as though subjected to unbearable strain in her final moments. What disturbed Harding most, however, was not her condition, but the quiet admission from Eleanor's sister. The Timothy Caldwell had visited the house the day before. He had sat with Eleanor for several hours, she said, playing quietly with a set of carved wooden animals she kept for visiting children. He had smiled, spoken politely, and seemed every bit the picture of an obedient guest, every bit. Yet when he left, Eleanor confessed she felt uneasy, though she could not explain why. She remarked only that the boy's questions were unusual. Questions about how long a person could live without food, how long it took for a heart to stop if someone were frightened badly enough. Questions spoken not with the innocent curiosity of a child, but with the calm persistence of one already calculating the answers. Harding recorded these accounts privately in his medical journal, but he knew what the townsfolk were already whispering. Timothy Caldwell had been present before two mysterious deaths, both inexplicable, both unsettling in their detail. Still, suspicion is not proof, and Salem was a community bound tightly by appearances. To accuse an 8-year-old of malice, let alone murder, was almost unthinkable. Yet there were others who had seen things that added to the quiet unease. One neighbor claimed she had observed Timothy watching Eleanor's house from the tree line days before her death, his posture still and statuesque, as though waiting. Another recalled the boy's unusual questions at church, when he asked the minister how long it took for a soul to leave the body after death. These recollections, scattered and seemingly harmless on their own, began to form a pattern too dark to ignore. After Eleanor's burial, Harding found himself tormented by the boy's image. He remembered Jacob Miller's collapse, Timothy's unnerving composure, and now this second loss, with the boy's presence stitched into its edges. At night, Harding dreamt of Timothy, standing in the shadows of his examination room, his pale blue eyes fixed and unblinking, his lips parted in the faintest smile, a smile that contained no warmth, only the quiet satisfaction of hidden knowledge. The doctor wrestled with his conscience. Could a child truly harbor such darkness? Was it possible that Timothy understood something of human frailty that others could not? Science in 1867 offered little guidance on the mysteries of the mind, and Harding was left stranded between medicine and superstition. Yet the town began to turn. Eleanor Wright's death could not be dismissed as chance. Whispers grew bolder. Mothers pulled their children closer when Timothy passed by. Fathers spoke in hushed tones of the Caldwell boy and the curse he seemed to carry. Even the church. Plows felt colder when he entered, the silence sharpening as though the congregation itself recoiled. The Caldwell family, however, appeared blind to the unease. Timothy's father, a stern farmer hardened by years of labor, dismissed the rumors as baseless cruelty. His mother insisted her son was gentle, misunderstood, different, perhaps, but incapable of malice. To them, Timothy was a quiet, clever boy with an unusual mind. They could not, or would not, see the shadow that stretched behind him. But for Dr. Harding, doubt had become certainty. 2 deaths could not be coincidence. He began to suspect that Timothy did not simply witness suffering. He studied it, that behind his polite demeanor and careful manners was a calculating mind, testing, observing, refining. And if this were true, Harding knew something grim. The boy was only beginning, for each experiment must lead to another, each question to a deeper one. And if Timothy Caldwell had already crossed the threshold once, and then again, there was no reason to believe he would stop. The town, unknowingly, was living alongside an unfolding pattern of cruelty, and the second death was only the middle step. By the time summer approached, a third tragedy would reveal just how far the boy's curiosity had grown, and how little humanity remained behind his pale, unblinking eyes. Salem was no longer the same town it had been in a year before. The laughter of children felt quieter. The songs at Sunday service seemed muted, and the Caldwell name, once spoken without thought, now carried a weight that made lips tighten and voices drop. Something unseen had settled over the community, something shaped like fear. The second death, that of Eleanor Wright, still haunted the town when whispers began to circle once more. And this time, there would be no possibility of dismissing what happened as accident, illness, or unfortunate chance. For the third death struck closer to the heart of Salem than any before. The victim was not a solitary widow or an aging farmer. It was a child. Her name was Sarah Whitcomb, the 9-year-old daughter of a blacksmith. She was bright, lively, and known for her quick wit. In a community where work weighed heavily on even the youngest shoulders, Sarah's spirit was often described as a kind of light. She had been seen laughing in the schoolyard only days before her disappearance. Alone, unlike the others, Sarah was not immediately found. On the evening of July 11th, she failed to return home. Her father, John Whitcomb, searched the town frantically, his voice carrying through the fields and alleyways as lanterns flickered to life. Neighbors joined the search, their torches sweeping the roadsides and the banks of the creek. Salem was small enough that a child could not simply vanish, and yet for hours there was no trace of her. It was Timothy Caldwell who claimed to have seen her last. He told John Whitcomb that Sarah had walked with him past the schoolhouse that afternoon, speaking of a bird's nest she had found in the tall grass. He said she parted ways with him as dusk fell, promising she would head straight home. His story was clear, his tone steady. Too steady, some noted. By dawn, the search turned grim. Sarah's body was discovered near the edge of the Caldwell property. lying face down in a shallow pool where rainwater had gathered. The scene, though outwardly simple, carried details that chilled the searchers. Her hands were clenched tight, her knuckles scraped raw, as though she had struggled against something unseen. Her eyes were open, wide, with a final expression of terror, and her lips bore the faint trace of blood, not from injury but from biting down hard, as if silencing a scream. Dr. Harding, summoned again, examined the body. His hands trembled as he recorded the details. There were no fatal wounds, no sign of drowning, no illness to explain the child's death. Instead, he found evidence of something far more disturbing. Sarah's pulse, in his estimation, had not stopped from external force, but from sudden, overwhelming shock. Her heart had simply ceased, arrested not by accident, but by fight. She died of fear, Harding wrote privately. But fear of what? In the hours that followed, the town turned its gaze upon Timothy Caldwell. He had been the last to see Sarah alive. The sight of her death lay on his family's land. And though no hand had marked her skin, the shadow of his presence was enough to ignite the whispers into open suspicion. Witnesses came forward with recollections they had long kept silent. One child admitted that Timothy once trapped a bird beneath a glass jar, watching with fascination as it beat its wings until exhaustion claimed it. Another told of how he described, in unsettling detail, the sound a rabbit made when it starved. Adults, too, confessed unease. A farmhand remembered finding Timothy near the stables, staring at a horse's labored breathing with an intensity that felt more like study than sympathy. All these accounts, harmless when scattered, now formed a mosaic of dread. And within that mosaic, Sarah Whitcomb's lifeless eyes seemed to accuse not just fate, but a boy whose curiosity had crossed a threshold most could not imagine. Yet no law could be applied. The sheriff, bound by the absence of wounds or witnesses, declared the matter unresolved. The Whitcombs buried their daughter in a grief so heavy that it silenced the town for weeks. But silence did not mean acceptance. In every home, at every gathering, one question remained unspoken but present. Was Timothy Caldwell a child, or something else? Dr. Harding, more than any, wrestled with this question. He recalled the boy's steady recounting of his last moments with Sarah, the unnerving calm in his voice. Harding believed then, as he confessed in his notes years later, that Timothy had not merely been present at her death, but had orchestrated the conditions of it. He learns, the doctor wrote, each death teaches him something new. Each silence, each breath, each failure of the heart, he records in his mind like a ledger. The weight of this conclusion bore heavily on Harding. He began to avoid Timothy in public. But at night he dreamt of him still, always with the same pale eyes, always with the same slight smile. For the townsfolk, the third death crossed a threshold. Where before there had been whispers, now there was distance. Families forbade their children from visiting the Caldwell farm. Some spoke of leaving Salem altogether. Timothy's parents, defensive and proud, shielded their son with greater intensity, refusing to acknowledge the suspicions of their neighbors. But their denial could not erase the truth. Wherever Timothy Caldwell walked, shadows followed. The tragedy of Sarah Whitcomb became more than a death. It became a warning. Salem was no longer simply a town with an unfortunate family in its midst. It was a town living beside a force it could neither name nor restrain. And even then, as grief settled over the Whitcomb household, there were those who feared aloud. If Timothy Caldwell's curiosity had not been satisfied, then another tragedy was inevitable. They were right, for the fourth death would not be distant in time. It would arrive swiftly, and it would finally force Salem to confront what it had so long tried to deny. The Whitcomb funeral had not yet faded from memory when Salem, Massachusetts was forced once more to gather in mourning. The ground was still, unsettled over Sarah's grave when another coffin was lowered into the earth, this time heavier, broader, and carrying within it not a child, but a man in the prime of his life. His name was Thomas Yates. Thomas was 32, a farmer whose hands bore the roughness of honest labor. He was respected for his strength, admired for his fairness, and beloved by those who knew him well. He had spoken openly, after Sarah's death, about Timothy Caldwell. Too openly. "That boy's no boy," he had muttered in the tavern, his words bitter with drink but sharpened by conviction. "He's a shadow with flesh wrapped round it, and mark me, he'll bring more death before long." Some whispered that Thomas had become reckless in his accusations, but others admitted after the fact that he had voiced what many were too fearful to say aloud. In a town balanced uneasily between suspicion and denial, Thomas stood firm in his refusal to look away. On the evening of August 3rd, Thomas left his farmhouse to tend to his livestock. The sun had long set, the fields quiet beneath a clouded moon. When he failed to return, his wife, Mary, searched the yard with a lantern. She found no sign of him, but as dawn broke, the search widened, and it was there, in the hayloft of his barn, that Thomas's body was discovered. The sight was unlike any Salem had ever seen. Thomas lay slumped against a beam, his eyes open, his mouth frozen mid-breath. His arms hung limp at his sides, and though no rope bound him, his posture was that of a man held still by something unseen. Most chilling of all was his chest, not crushed, not pierced, but strangely motionless, as though the very act of drawing breath had been taken from him. Dr. Harding's account described the scene in words that still disturbed the page. The man was not strangled. He was not smothered. His lungs bear no mark of smoke or water. His heart, once strong, now resembles that of an elder, arrested, stilled, without sign of disease. His features suggest terror. He died not in struggle, but in surrender. It is as though life itself was persuaded to abandon him. If Sarah's death had been explained away as fright, Thomas's could not. Here was a man of strength, a body hardened by toil, undone without a single bruise to tell its story. And though no witness saw the moment of his passing, suspicion had already drawn its line, for Timothy Caldwell had been there. Neighbors swore they saw the boy walking on the edge of the Yates property that evening, his figure pale against the barn light. When asked later, Timothy admitted as much. He claimed he had wandered to watch the livestock. A calf had been born that week, and he wished to see it. His words were simple, his face without emotion. "I heard Mr. Yates cry out," he said, and then it stopped. Those words chilled even the sheriff. The pattern had become undeniable. First Eleanor Wright, then Sarah Whitcomb, and now Thomas Yates, each death stranger than the last, each linked by proximity, by timing, by that unblinking gaze of the Caldwell boy. Yet again, the law had no hold. There were no wounds, no weapons, no confessions, only fear. But this death marked a turning. Where before the town had spoken in whispers, now voices grew louder. Mothers kept their children indoors. Men sharpened, their tools not for work, but for protection. The Caldwell farm, once merely a place of wary avoidance, became a site of outright hostility. Neighbors passed its fields with heads turned muttering prayers under their breath. And still, Timothy walked freely. He attended church, though pews shifted to distance from him. He lingered at the general store, though conversations halted the moment he entered. He moved, calm and unhurried, through a town unraveling in fear. Dr. Harding, tormented by his own inability to intervene, wrote of his dread, "If Thomas Yates fell, what protection has any man? The boy's education continues, not in books, but in death. He studies us as one studies insects. Each passing leaves him unchanged, yet each deepens his understanding. His youth is no shield, for his mind is not that of a child, I fear we are subjects in an experiment none of us consented to. The tragedy of Thomas Yates ignited a fire Salem had long avoided. At the tavern, men spoke openly now of justice. Some whispered of banishment, others of the gallows. Mary Yates, pale with grief, demanded retribution in the name of her husband. But when challenged directly, Caldwell's stood defiant. "Our boy is innocent," his mother declared. "You will not lay a hand on him." Yet as August deepened, unease shifted toward inevitability. Salem, Massachusetts could no longer ignore the shadow in its midst. 4 deaths, each inexplicable, each circling closer to the heart of the community, had transformed the Caldwell case from rumor into legend. And though the town did not yet know it, the story was not finished. For shadows do not end when the sun rises, they only shift. The 5th death was approaching, and with it, Salem would face a reckoning not even its strongest could prevent. By late August of 1872, Salem was no longer the quiet Missouri town it had been. The deaths of Eleanor Wright, Sarah Whitcomb, and Thomas Yates had shaken it to its core. Farmers spoke less of crops and more of graves. Children were hushed not with lullabies, but with warnings. And through it all, Timothy Caldwell moved in. Silence, as though untouched by the storms his presence conjured. But the 5th death was coming. It was August 19th, when Reverend Josiah Green collapsed during his evening sermon. He had been mid-sentence, his voice rising in thunderous rebuke, condemning, as many later recalled, the evil in Salem's midst. His gaze had turned directly toward the Caldwell pew, where Timothy sat motionless beside his parents. The Reverend's words froze, his hand clutching at the pulpit. A silence fell over the congregation. Then came the fall, sudden, heavy, final. By the time he struck the wooden floor, his heart had ceased. Witnesses swore they saw it. That in the instant before his collapse, Timothy's eyes lifted and, locked with the Reverend's, holding him until his last breath was drawn. There was no recovery this time. No physician's theory. No cautious denial. A healthy man, a man of faith and strength, undone before the entire town. His death could not be hidden in barns or explained away by fright. It was public, undeniable, and terrifying. Salem broke. The church, once a sanctuary, became a place of panic. Women fainted. Men seized their families and dragged them into the night. By dawn, torches flickered along Main Street. The town had decided. Timothy Caldwell could no longer remain among them. Sheriff Elias Morton himself admitted in later testimony, "I could hold the law in my hand, but not the fear in men's hearts." And fear was the stronger that night. The mob descended upon the Caldwell farm. What happened next was recorded only in fragments, and even those fragments contradict. Some accounts speak of Caldwell's fleeing into the night. Others claim the farmhouse was set aflame, though no official record of fire remains. A few insist Timothy did not resist, but stood quietly in the doorway, watching as if awaiting an outcome he already knew, for Timothy Caldwell had been there. What is certain is this. After that night, the Caldwell family vanished. No bodies were buried, no possessions were inventoried. The farm, by some accounts, was dismantled and its timbers scattered. By others, it was simply abandoned, left to rot. And yet, in the official archive of Pettis County, 1872, there is no mention of a mob, no record of banishment, no note of disappearance. The Caldwells, it seems, were erased not only from Salem, but from history itself. Dr. Harding's final letter, written weeks after the events, carries the weight of his unease. "I write in secrecy, for already the records are being cleansed. The town desires silence, not truth. Yet I cannot silence my conscience. That boy, Timothy, he was no ordinary child. He bore witness to 5 deaths, each without hand or blade, each without mark. I do not claim to know what he was, only that he was not what he seemed. And if he walks still, it is not merely Salem that should fear, but every place where shadows fall. After 1872, the Caldwell name disappears entirely from Missouri's census rolls. The farm, if it stood at all, returned to soil. By the time rail expansion swept through Pettis County at the turn of the century, no trace remained. And yet rumors persisted. Travelers spoke of a pale boy seen lingering near riverbanks long after the Caldwell disappearance. A diary found decades later in a farmhouse attic described livestock refusing to cross a certain field. And in Salem itself, some families forbade their children from walking near the North Woods after dark, muttering of the shadow child who waited there. The erasure was not complete, for stories, unlike records, are harder to silence. What was Timothy Caldwell? A boy cursed with misfortune, an embodiment of the town's fears, or something far older, a presence wearing the shape of a child? The archive offers no answers. The pages are missing, the testimonies cut short, the names struck through. But the deaths remain. 5 in a single summer, each unexplained, each tethered to a boy whose very existence Salem sought to forget. And perhaps that is the most chilling. Truth of all, history does not always preserve what happened. Sometimes it buries what it cannot bear to remember. So when you read through old county records, when you walk past the forgotten graves of towns long gone, ask yourself, what stories are missing? What truths have been erased? And what shadows still linger, waiting to be found? Because Salem, in the summer of 1872, left behind more than silence. It left behind a question that no archive can answer, and perhaps no one should. If you've stayed with this story until the end, you now carry a piece of that forgotten shadow with you. What do you believe? Was Timothy Caldwell an innocent boy trapped in fear and superstition, or something unearthly that Salem barely survived? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think really happened in that summer of 1872. And if you want more chilling stories from history's lost corners, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every forgotten archive, every erased page hides something waiting to be uncovered, because the past is never as quiet as it seems. For Timothy Caldwell had been there.